Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a couple of questions. Why do almost half of Americans not vote? And what does this say about the legitimacy of America's leaders and political system? Let's get to the bottom line. America prides itself as one of the world's great democracies. In a vibrant democracy, everyone has a say in how they're governed. So how can we explain why more than 100 million Americans simply don't vote, more than 40% of the eligible population? And why does America rank almost dead last when it comes to turnout rates in developed countries? What does this disengagement mean for the policies and legislation in this country? And what does it mean for the future of America's democracy? Fortunately, we're joined by people who have the answers to these questions. In Miami, Florida, Evette Alexander, a director at the Knight Foundation, which published a landmark study on American non-voters last month named the 100 Million Project. In Washington, D.C., Ted Johnson, a senior fellow at the Brennan Center, which focuses on reforming the country's systems of democracy and justice. And in New York, Kellen Edmonson, the field director of HeadCount, which works to register voters and promote participation in democracy. Thank you all very much for joining us. Let me just start out showing this one graphic. Fascinating to me anyway. It shows that in the 2016 race, Hillary Clinton received 28.5% of the popular vote in the United States. Donald Trump received 27.3%. But those that didn't vote are 41.3%. So the non-voters win in that particular case. And I would figure that that's pretty distressing. And Evette, I know that you conducted this major study funded by the Knight Foundation that began to look at this question of why in this democracy, which is the sort of looks at itself as the premier democracy in the world, in the United States, why are people not voting?
That's right. The gap between the United States and other developed democracies, as you mentioned, really stood out to the Knight Foundation. This isn't a new issue. It's been ongoing for decades, but we also noticed that we actually don't understand much about this population that doesn't vote. A lot of our political polling and other political studies are often focused on those who come most often to the polls because they're seen as the ones who influence the election result. But actually, by virtue of their lack of participation, so do non-voters, and we actually know very little about them. So the study focused on, giving them a voice to tell us why they don't engage with the system, what they think about politics, what they think about 2020, and we surveyed almost 12,000 chronic non-voters, so it's the largest study of its kind.
Well, I noticed in one of the graphs you have in this study, it's a large and fascinating study of that, they list, at least among those that are not voting, that they're just not interested, that they don't care. And secondly, that they don't feel their vote matters. What are some of the other reasons that you found that voters aren't engaged?
So there are a myriad of reasons why voters and particular groups of voters are less engaged. Some of them are institutional, some of them are behavioral because, of course, we're not born knowing how to vote or valuing that action. So it's something that we learn along the way. And in the report, we asked people why they don't vote, and we have their answers on that. We also compared certain attitudes and behaviors amongst non-voters with those of active voters, so we have some insights there as well. So when we ask voters why they don't vote, these are folks who are eligible to vote but don't, they tell us a variety of reasons. The top most cited ones were that they aren't interested in politics, that they somehow feel that their vote doesn't matter. And then the other, and that they don't like the candidates. That was another big reason for non-voters. They simply don't like the candidates. And a lot of active voters feel the same as well, but they still participate. So when we drill down to look at some key differences we found in the study, we found that there were, across demographic groups, there were large differences in terms of the levels of trust that folks have in the election. So non-voters were much less likely to trust that the elections represent the will of the people. Only about half of non-voters felt that the election results were even valid, which is a large percentage. And then we also found that that they have a lower engagement with news and information. So active voters are much more likely to be consuming news and political information. Non-voters not as much actively seeking that out, instead relying on bumping into it as they go about their day from social media or friends and family, other sources.
Right. Yeah, so Kellen and Ted, Kellen, you're out trying to recruit people, get them registered to vote, get them engaged. Ted, you've been writing about this same issue of, particularly looking at race and other demographic issues, which Evette just mentioned, looking at the dynamics there of what's not connecting or what may be connecting, and people just say, I'm done with it. What is the right way to look at this question of looking at demographics and why it matters that we bring either youth or Black Americans or Latino Americans and others into the voting pool? Why aren't they motivated on their own? Why do they need a push from you, Kellen?
So from us, one thing we really are looking at is the disengagement of youth. And one thing we really want to kind of focus in on is really why. And I think there's a lot of things that Evette said about why that really contribute to this. But number one at the top of the list, I think, when I'm out in the field, when we have volunteers out in the field, they go out and they talk to folks, and a common response for folks that say that they don't come out and vote is we just don't vote, and I'm not engaged in the system, and so a lot of what Evette said. And so my response, and I think a lot of what our volunteers do in the field as well, is really talk to them and say, I'm not going to talk to you as to, try to convince you or try and tell you that it's important to come out and vote on Election Day. But I think it's good for you to be registered just in case there's an issue or there's a candidate that you become really, really interested in that might come down the line.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because recently in one of the debates between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, Bernie Sanders made an interesting comment. He said, with older voters, there's just no doubt that Joe Biden represents their interests and their aspirations. But that he said, I, Bernie Sanders, have the future of the nation supporting me. I have the younger generation that supports where I am. And I'm fascinated by that. Is there a zero-sum game that's going on between the youth in the country and the elderly? It raises the interesting question of why those that are 50 and over would want to support those youth coming in, because they seem to be pointing in different directions politically. I'm trying to understand. I know that many people look at this moral responsibility and a national responsibility in a democracy to bring in as many as possible, but it raises the question of conflicting interests.
Yes, definitely. And I think there needs to be more conversation there's a huge chasm right now within the Democratic Party. And so I think what you're seeing is these two different sides warring. You have the progressive side and the moderate side. And I really think just more open and basic conversation, there really needs to be kind of a negotiation among those groups, not just within Democratic Party politics, but I think larger conversations among young folks and older folks so that, people can come to the table, both sides understand what issues are important to them, and then coming to a compromise as people, as citizens of the United States to, really create a vision that I think makes sense for both sides. And
right. Now, Ted, I think you have a different take on some of this, both on the issues that if you look at Black voters in America, that they can be highly informed, they can understand what's going on, but they have chosen not to participate. And I'm interested in you breaking that down for us.
Yeah, so it's like both very simple and complicated. So the first thing is that the story of Black people in the United States is a story of voter disenfranchisement, whether being unable to vote while enslaved, and then after the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments are passed, Black men at least are given the right to vote. And within a decade, the Compromise of 1877 and a bunch of historical events removed Black people from the voter rolls. And then terror is essentially used to ensure that even though the right to vote exists,
can I stop you just for a second, Ted? Can you remind people of the history that after the Civil War, at that time, Black participation was huge. Black participation and membership within the United States Senate and the House of Representatives was enormous in the House. I just want to punctuate that. It's a very important part of American history that many people don't remember.
That's absolutely right. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment essentially makes those formerly enslaved people citizens, and the 15th Amendment extends the access to the ballot for those folks. And when they begin voting, more than 90% of Black Americans at that time are in the South, and black men being enfranchised completely reconfigures political power in the South. And now you have formerly enslaved black people that are arriving in Congress, in state assemblies, in local office, having been duly voted by the citizenry to be there. About a decade later, certainly around 1876, 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes is running for the White House against Samuel Tilden. These two, there's an electoral college dispute, and the Compromise of 1877 is when the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, removes federal protection from the South and allows the states in the Deep South to now begin to disenfranchise black Americans again. And we get Jim Crow being ushered in. So what we have here is a history of denying the right to vote for black people. And even after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as we see an enormous rise in black voter participation, we then see in the last 5 years a reversal of many of these voting rights protections following some Supreme Court decisions. So from the very beginning, once slavery ends, through to today, there has been voter purges, voter suppression, and all these attempts to remove black folks from the rolls. That has an effect on morale that we're still seeing
So
today.
I get all of that, and I appreciate you making it so clear. What I don't understand is that despite voter suppression strategies, which we may discuss, despite the legacy and the impacts on morale, why many black voters who have so much on the line aren't more engaged than they are, because we saw they became engaged. They were a key factor in Barack Obama's election, and they floated very high. And in today's I think in today's electoral race that we see going on right now, the pursuit of the black voter as an inflection point, a potential inflection point, is so high. So to go back to Evette's fascinating study, what are the dynamics there? Many people say they're just overwhelmed by the information. They're not like professional political followers, or they look at the system as corrupt. Are there things in the dynamics of that can be tweaked to bring various ethnic communities more into the game?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Let's go to Ted and then Evette.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it absolutely is true that you can. The biggest thing is you can get candidates that are that inspire voters, that mobilize voters through outreach, through descriptive representation, and by reaching out to these specific communities that are putting people in office who look like them or who have a similar shared experience. That often inspires people to go to the polls. This is what we saw with Barack Obama. In 2012, black voter participation was at about 66.5%. And then in 2016, for a number of reasons, it dropped 7 points, the first time it's dropped in 20 years. But here's the thing. Black non-voters are very much like white non-voters. That is to say, the American non-voting population, the reasons for not voting may stem from different places, but the rationale for deciding not to participate is very similar. And so there's not a special reason why we're seeing black people not going to the polls. It's the same reason, that they're not seeing from their government what they expect, that they're not enthusiastic about the candidates. And in this way, black folks are just Americans.
Evette?
Yeah, I would very much agree with that based on what we heard from the study. Just linking a few things we've talked about in terms of demographics and then also news and information. So, we know that voting participation rates are highly correlated with your level of education and your level of income. And of course, those have some racial demographics that are associated with them. So, if you're upper income, if you're have a college degree or higher, you're way more likely to vote. And if you're an African American voter with a college degree, you're very likely to vote. Unfortunately, like our society looks a little bit, disproportionate that way in terms of who holds college degrees. But I think, as that changes, that will have a good impact on more representative voting participation. And then also there is the sense, like as he mentioned, of not being inspired by candidates. That was the #1 reason for black voters as well as white voters and Hispanics. So that's just a pervasive feeling. The other thing that we heard a lot of is just not feeling like the decisions made in Washington impact your life, or that the candidates are going to carry through on the promises made on the campaign trail. So I think that we have an educational duty both in our secondary school system, but also for our adult population on how and why decisions made in Washington can impact our communities, our families, our lives, and what is the value proposition for taking the time and effort to participate. And then on the news and information front, again, people who don't hold college degrees are more likely to be overwhelmed by information or not know where to go. And of course, we have very civically engaged people who don't hold college degrees, but by and large, there is a bit of an association there. So we see that the way that people consume news and information, when you compare non-voters and voters, is kind of different. They're a little bit more weighted towards entertainment. We're a generation Netflix now, and there's a lot of streaming media, a lot of streaming entertainment at our fingertips, and news isn't exactly always in that stream. Or if we're scrolling through social media, we might see news articles, but there's a competition with other things catching our interest, or people might be just reading headlines a lot of the times. When we look at young people, they're even more likely to display some of these behaviors with news and information. So a great challenge going forward is how to allow populations who aren't really heavy traditional news consumers experience the feeling of being informed on key political issues without having to drastically change their behavior.
Well, that media, I mean, I know you're in part, the Knight Foundation is related to the Miami Herald and the legacy of media down there. That's a whole nother show we need to get into, is the impact of media. But Kellen, let me ask you a question here. I'm interested in whether fear and anger are the drivers of what we saw before, and whether that needs to happen with the youth vote as well, because clearly I think some of the youth's own interests have been eroded in this time.
Definitely. I think there is certainly a lot of credibility to that statement, that it was fear and anger that brought people out to the polls in 2016. And I think in 2020, you're seeing a lot of young people rally around someone like Bernie Sanders, because he also, I think more so than anger, I think he brings out a certain passion that is really, really key. And I think people see, especially young people, see that as extremely genuine.
Right.
And so for us at HeadCount, what we really want to focus on is just allowing those young people to embrace that passion. And so that same passion that they might bring to a artist or their favorite band, maybe seeing that translate over to a certain candidate or a certain issue.
Right.
I think youth in this country have done a great job of embracing some awesome issues. You saw in 2018 with what happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School.
Right. I should remind the global audience that was the massive gun incident, many young people killed, and then a major movement that grew out of that.
Yes.
To establish gun policies.
Yes. So I think just the March for Our Lives, and HeadCount actually had a presence there. We had a large activation where we registered a ton of people to vote. But you see young people embrace those issues such as gun control, and also the climate crisis that's currently enveloping us as well.
How tough is your job now, Kellen, in the age of the coronavirus? When I remember when I was in college, MTV and Rock the Vote were the way to get out. You go to big concerts and parties and register. You're around people. It was a social experience, essentially, to draw young people into voting. Does that harm your ability to go out and do the kinds of things you're doing now, is that the coronavirus has become a damper on building those connections and creating that momentum?
That's a great question, Steve. And over the course of 16 years with HeadCount, we've established some wonderful partnerships with artists and other corporate sponsors, and that has allowed us to, despite not having a presence on the ground, that's really allowed us to, in this very difficult and kind of unprecedented time, really expand our online presence and really looking into getting people registered to vote through our digital means. In 2019, HeadCount registered over 60,000 voters, and actually 2/3 of those voters registered were through online means. And so we already have an existing infrastructure to ensure that folks are still getting registered online. And we're really looking into other ways that people can come out and exercise their right to vote, whether that's through absentee voting, looking at kind of creating a beginner's guide so that folks can come out and exercise their right to vote through that means, rather than having to go to the polls. As you've seen, there have been 2 primaries now that have been postponed due to the coronavirus. And so getting back to your question, Steve, those states are Georgia and Louisiana, by the way. And Steve, getting back to your question, though our bread and butter really is having boots on the ground and working with concert goers, at that grassroots level,
Right.
also through our community events as well. We really don't see any loss in momentum because we really do see this
Right.
as a great opportunity to enhance our advance what we're doing on.
Right. Ted and Evette, I'm going to ask you the same question about the impact of coronavirus. And Ted, when I look at some of the voter suppression activities that are just clear as day in Georgia, which has sort of seemed to be the poster child, if you will, for trying to keep people off the rolls and removing them from the rolls. And I'm fascinated by this notion that if you don't use your vote, you lose it. You're stricken off the voter rolls. But I'm also, just in our last couple of minutes here, just interested in how you see whether the coronavirus is something that is surmountable by a community you've been writing and thinking about, or whether this is going to portend a continuation of what we have today, which is really another block on voting. Is it something that you think the black community can overcome?
So it'll depend. Ultimately, the answer is yes, but the level of difficulty will depend on the states and the secretaries of state that decide how these polls will be conducted. If you look at all of the data, if you live in a black area, your wait times are long, 3-4 hours. There are less polling districts. They're further away from you. There have been a number of efforts to try to restrict the types of accepted IDs, to close polling stations for a myriad of reasons. And so if Corona provides a Secretary of State that wants to suppress the black vote another opportunity to do so, I would not be surprised if those secretaries of state take that opportunity.
Right.
That said, black voter turnout, while it may be more difficult for these communities to vote, the research is still up in the air on
Right.
just how successful it can be. We saw in the special
Right.
senatorial election that black voters overcame voter suppression measures
Right.
in large quantities in order to beat the Republican candidate and send a Democratic senator
Right.
from Alabama for the first time in some years.
Thank you. Evette, I'm going to give you the last word. You did the Anchors study here. I encourage people to take a look at it. But I'd ask you, I know you're an analyst and you're looking at behaviors, not necessarily predicting how things will go, but given, I think, a combination of apathy or people, seeing the system as corrupt, or that it's too overwhelming, or that it doesn't really, that their vote doesn't matter. As you look at this coronavirus period, do you have any insights on what the collective system might be done to salvage electoral participation in a time like this?
Well, this is outside my area of expertise, but I'll offer a few thoughts based on what we saw in the study. So one, we know that disengagement with news and information around politics specifically is correlated with a lack of participation. And I do think everyone's attention now has shifted from the primaries, from the election, and onto this coronavirus crisis. So it'll be interesting to see how attention can shift back to what's happening in politics and gearing up for 2020 and gathering people's attention there. And then the other thing I would say is that this might actually serve to help folks see the impact that decisions made in Washington might have on their personal lives and communities. So we'll have to see if that has an effect.
Well, Evette, thank you so much for the study. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. In Miami, Florida, Evette Alexander from the Knight Foundation. In Washington, D.C., Ted Johnson from the Brennan Center. And in New York, Kellen Edmonson from the voter registration organization HeadCount. Thanks so much. So what's the bottom line? Democracy is a balancing act, and America is made up of very different audiences. Some are apathetic and just not engaged. Some don't feel their vote counts. And they talk about things like the Electoral College, which we didn't get into in this show, but it matters. Some don't vote because they find the logistics too much to deal with, and others feel like they're harassed, as if their vote is not welcome. But by sitting out on the sidelines, you deserve what you get, and you may not like the results. And that's the bottom line.